The joint hearing will come to order. Let me begin by thanking everyone for joining us today. I hope that my colleagues, our witnesses, and viewers are staying healthy and safe. I want to thank Chairman Payne and Ranking Member King of the Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Subcommittee for coming together with Ranking Member Crenshaw and me to hold this hearing. We're here to discuss federal and state efforts to procure critical supplies in response to the coronavirus pandemic. First, I want to acknowledge that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Fema, which was put in charge of the federal government's response, was asked to testify today. While FEMA is not here today, I understand that Administrator Gaynor plans to appear before the full committee later this month. I'm pleased to hear this because it's vital that we work together to address this challenge. I look forward to meeting with Administrator Gaynor in person soon and hearing what our witnesses have to share today to inform that discussion. There's no denying that the coronavirus pandemic has presented unparalleled challenges. One of the greatest challenges has been securing adequate testing supplies and personal protective equipment, or PPE, such as gowns, gloves, surgical masks, and N95 respirators. A surge in global demand for these supplies, most of which are produced overseas, caused severe shortages, especially for those on the front lines. In response, the federal government distributed the limited supplies in the Strategic National Stockpile and expedited PPE shipments by airlift to distributors' existing customers rather than to states directly. This caused states to find their own supplies to distribute to areas with greatest need. As a result, competition within the United States intensified as states began competing against each other, the federal government, and other buyers around the world. This competition for limited resources drove up prices and attracted new brokers into the marketplace that were inexperienced and unreliable. Buyers with less purchasing power, such as smaller states and rural areas like those here in the district I serve in New Mexico, had greater difficulty obtaining supplies. Some states and major hospitals have been able to replenish supplies, but reports of shortages among healthcare workers, especially those in nursing care settings, still exist. Demand for supplies is only expected to grow as several states continue to experience rapidly rising rates of new infections and hospitalizations. Public health officials also predict that a second wave of infections will come this fall. We must also consider the PPE needs of non-healthcare workers if we want to successfully reopen the economy, which we all do. Therefore, it's important to take this opportunity to discuss lessons learned from the past 6 months to improve the procurement and distribution of critical supplies in the future. This includes revisiting the appointment of FEMA as the lead of the federal response effort in mid-March, more than 6 weeks after the White House Coronavirus Task Force was formed, a delay that unquestionably put the agency at a disadvantage of executing such a formidable task. FEMA is well versed in responding to disasters, but it has struggled to procure supplies in the wake of multiple disasters in the past. In a joint subcommittee hearing last May, we discussed long-standing challenges with FEMA's process for vetting vendors and overseeing disaster contracts awarded by state and local governments. I'm concerned that FEMA once again awarded contracts to vendors who could not deliver during the pandemic. In one case, FEMA canceled a $55 million contract for 10 million N95 respirators after the company, which conducts tactical training and has no history of procuring medical equipment, failed to deliver the masks. In another case, FEMA warned states not to use testing equipment it acquired under a $10 million contract because it was believed to be contaminated. This company that produced the equipment was formed just 6 days before FEMA awarded the contract. I also worry about whether pandemic response activities have already fatigued FEMA's historically understaffed contracting workforce, which is concerning since we are only 1 month into the 2020 hurricane season and entering an active wildfire season. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on their views of FEMA's role in leading the federal response effort and how we can work together to improve the procurement and distribution of critical pandemic supplies. Thank you again for joining us today. Since we have a number of members joining today, I will be vigilant in watching the clock and ask that my colleagues be mindful of their time available for statements and questions. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Torres Small and Chairman Payne. I'm pleased to participate in this hearing today. Today's hearing is to examine matters related to the management and distribution of medical supplies in response to the pandemic. This topic is of the utmost importance to our country and to each of our states. My home state of Texas recently experienced an uptick in reported cases, as did 33 other states. Many are holding steady, and only three states saw a decline in the number of cases last week. As we see cases increasing, we must ensure that our healthcare providers and first responders have the equipment they need to provide treatment while protecting themselves and slowing the spread of the virus. The size and scope of this response effort is unprecedented. We have not experienced anything like this in the history of our country. Some experts have compared this to the outbreak of the Spanish flu in 1918, but today we are a much more mobile society, and our economy and supply chain are much more interconnected with the world. While we're using many of the same tools, such as social distancing, some quarantining, many of the supplies that doctors and hospitals use today to combat the virus are not manufactured in the United States. Because many of our medical supplies and pharmaceuticals are not produced domestically, we are competing with the rest of the world for the supplies we need to treat our people. Countries like China have a stranglehold on our medical supply chain. We must take steps to regain control of the supply chain from the communist regime. This is especially important during a global pandemic. To make matters worse, there's evidence that China deliberately misled the world about the extent of the outbreak in that country while hoarding critical medical supplies and decreasing exports to the rest of the world. Had we known the true number of individuals infected in China, we would have quickly realized that our stockpile of ventilators and 95 respirators and other medical supplies were not going to be enough to meet the demand and been able to act earlier to meet the projected need. While we may have lost critical time at the beginning of the pandemic, once we began to understand the potential scope of the outbreak in this country, the administration took steps to increase the availability of necessary supplies. Fema was put in charge of distribution of medical supplies rather than HHS because of its logistical capabilities and relationship with state and local emergency managers. Fema established Project Airbridge to find medical supplies and quickly get them to where they were needed. The President used the Defense Production Act to encourage U.S. companies to join the fight against COVID-19 by altering their operations to provide for critical medical supplies. Ford, GE, General Motors stepped up to assist with manufacturing ventilators. 3M doubled its production of N95 masks to 100 million a month. Bauer, a U.S. company that makes hockey equipment, stopped making helmet visors and started producing face shields for medical professionals. As wearing a cloth face covering became a way of life for millions of Americans, MyPillow began producing masks to meet the demands of Americans' needs. After it became apparent that hand sanitizer was in short supply, many distillers, like Whitmeyer's in my district in Houston, converted from making alcohol for consumption to producing hand sanitizer. American companies are not just meeting PPE and medical equipment demand, but looking forward. In a month and a half, Houston's Metastar founder, Mansour Hirani, took his idea for a filter that can kill COVID from an idea to a prototype, to a tested and proven concept that kills 99.8% of the virus. And these are just a few examples of U.S. companies stepping up to support our country during the crisis. Many other companies have donated portions of their profits to aid in the fight against COVID. As we continue to learn more about this virus and the best ways to prevent its spread, we must continue to build our stockpile of medical supplies and ensure that our healthcare providers and first responders have the tools they need. Look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on the best ways to do that. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crenshaw. And I now recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's an honor and privilege to be with you and my colleagues here today. First, I'd like to say I hope everyone and their loved ones are staying safe and healthy, and my condolences to those who have lost loved ones because of the coronavirus. I would like to thank Chairwoman Torres Small and Ranking Member Crenshaw of the Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee for coming together with Ranking Member King and I to hold this hearing. I would also like to thank the witnesses for being here today to discuss pandemic and the challenges with supplies and procurement, a topic that is so incredibly important for our country at this moment. For too many communities, the pandemic is continuing to get worse. The magnitude of this pandemic is devastating. It didn't have to be this way, but there was a clear lack of leadership, most importantly at the White House itself. The lack of leadership extended to the federal government's procurement strategy, and those effects have been felt by states, local governments, and frontline workers who are trying to contain COVID-19 around the country without the proper PPE or supply. Instead of taking proactive steps early on to invoke the Defense Production Act, build up our supply reserves, and initiating a whole of government procurement strategy, and quickly getting testing supplies and other vital medical equipment out in the communities, President Trump was instead downplaying the threat of this virus and telling the American people that it was under control and was a problem that was going away. I hope that it is clear now, with more than 3 million cases and well over 130,000 deaths nationwide and daily cases on the rise, the virus was not and is still not under control. During the pandemic, states have been left to fend for themselves while dealing with a market that was unsubscribed and under-regulated. This led to chaos on the front lines, with our healthcare workers having to reuse masks or use trash bags as gowns in an effort to try to protect themselves. Efforts by the federal government to address supply shortages has also been marred with problems. These problems include the lack of coordination, have plagued the entire federal response. The initial response was disorganized, wasted valuable time that could have been used better to prepare for what was to come. These problems continue today. Rear Admiral Palawczyk, oh boy, I messed that one up, Palawczyk, head of the Supply Chain Stabilization Task Force, recently testified that the federal government still does not have information on the state stockpiles of PPE or other supplies. Or Project Airbridge, which has now been retired, but where reports have stated that many states and cities were not aware whether supplies brought into the country through Project Airbridge initiative were coming into their jurisdictions. Further, some shipments of PPE that FEMA coordinated to nursing homes around the country were reportedly defective and inefficient supplies. Finally, federal government contracts for supplies were not vetted properly before being awarded. This includes a $10 million contract to fill a kit for testing supplies that the agency then had to tell states not to use because the supplies were produced in an unsanitary condition. Given FEMA's history of procurement failures, Congress must conduct rigorous oversight to ensure past problems are fixed going forward. Neglecting to correct these mistakes will result in unnecessary lives lost, an outcome that we all want to avoid. Getting it right as soon as possible is especially important, as there are growing reports of PPE shortages once again, as states see a steep increase in new cases. To explore these topics, I'm glad that we have such an esteemed panel of experts here to help shed light on how we can do better in procuring, distributing supplies. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Payne. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement. Chairman Thompson, if you wouldn't mind just putting yourself off mute.
Nothing like being told what to do. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, let me thank everyone for being here. And like Chairman Payne indicated, I hope all is well. Mr. Fugate, it's always good seeing you. You've been a stellar person all your public career. The COVID-19 pandemic has put our nation in crisis. To date, the United States has reported over 3 million COVID-19 cases, and well over 130,000 people have died from complications associated with the virus. Even as states continue to set daily records for infections and new hotspots begin to emerge, the nation's top medical experts and scientists are predicting a second wave of COVID-19 infections. Obtaining and distributing critical supplies and medical equipment has proven to be among the most important and challenging factors in responding to COVID-19. The American people are looking to the federal government for leadership and support as the nation navigates these troubling times. The absence of leadership from the White House has resulted in a lack of a clear, coordinated federal procurement strategy that has caused complications and delays in states getting essential equipment. For example, President Trump told governors the federal government is not supposed to be out there buying vast amounts of items and then shipping. You know, we're not a shipping clerk, causing panic and chaos in the procurement process and reducing states' abilities to acquire what they need. In addition, states have to compete not only with each other for these critical supplies, but also with the rest of the world, significantly driving up prices. When FEMA took a larger role in the federal response 6 weeks after the pandemic started, its main responsibility was to improve the nation's access to these critical supplies through innovative, like the supply chain stabilization task force and Project Air Bridge. However, it was unrealistic to expect FEMA to come in and manage a full-blown crisis while planning for and responding to natural disasters, and to do it with a contracting workforce that had been understaffed and overworked in recent years. FEMA's initiatives caused confusion. States reported issues with communication surrounding equipment availability and delivery timeframe. Just last week, Governor Pritzker of Illinois called Project Air Bridge and other incomplete failure in testimony before this committee. That assessment is uninspiring given the accounts of non-federal volunteers led by Jared Kushner being embedded at FEMA to work on Project Air Bridge. Jared Kushner's action further contributed to confusion over who was in charge. While the committee had repeatedly requested more information on Project Air Bridge, FEMA has yet to provide the requested documents and information needed for us to do our oversight work. Though FEMA was the administration's choice for this mission because of its experience in disaster contracting and logistics, it has had a history of disaster contracting challenges. Infamous contracting fiascos like the award made to Bronze Star and Tribute during the 2017 hurricane seasons, FEMA's difficulty getting its procurement responsibilities right during the height of disasters. FEMA still struggles in this area, with the agency having to cancel a $55 million contract in May for its failure to deliver, and the company's failure to deliver any of the N95 masks that the company promised. The company had no prior experience obtaining medical supplies or equipment, and its parent company was bankrupt. Pantera, which is the company, should never have been awarded a contract in the first place. As COVID-19 cases continue to rise in states across the country, We must learn from our mistakes and adapt the federal response to better meet the needs of our communities and frontline workers. There's still time to get FEMA on track with its procurement processes and hope that the nation's preparedness posture will be much improved as we continue to battle the growing first wave of COVID-19 and prepare for a possible second wave in the fall. I'm grateful to the witnesses for taking the time to be here today to contribute to this important discussion. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back to
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the subcommittees will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their July 8th colloquy. I now welcome our panel of witnesses and thank them for joining today. Our first witness is Mr. Craig Fugate, who served as the FEMA administrator throughout the entirety of the Obama administration. During his tenure, he led the agency through more than 500 presidentially declared major disasters and emergencies. Prior to leading FEMA, Mr. Fugate headed the Florida Division of Emergency Management, where he led the state through many years of intense disasters and hurricanes. Before that, he worked in emergency management at the local level in Florida. Our second witness, Mr. Mark Gillarducci, serves as the director of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services for the state of California. He was first appointed to the position in July 2013 by Governor Brown and was reappointed by Governor Newsom in January 2019. Director Gillarducci serves as the governor's Homeland Security Advisor and oversees statewide public safety, emergency management, emergency communications, and counterterrorism. He has more than 30 years of experience in public safety and government management at the local, state, and federal levels. Our final witness, Mr. Chris Curry, is a director on the Homeland Security and Justice team at the Government Accountability Office. He leads the agency's work on national preparedness, emergency management, and critical infrastructure protection issues. Mr. Curry has been with GAO since 2002 and has been the recipient of numerous agency awards, including the Meritorious Service Award in 2008. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Fugate.
Thank you, Madam Chair, chairs and ranking members, and all the committees. We can spend a lot of time talking about what goes wrong in these types of responses. I want to introduce some ideas that may be able to minimize these impacts later. And it goes back to, in your opening statement, several key issues you've had. FEMA was brought in late. A lot of this has to do with that FEMA is too often only seen as the agency to respond to states for natural hazards. Even though, as the Homeland Security Act, as amended, or also known as the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, essentially gives the president the authority to use FEMA in any crisis, not just when there is a Stafford Act declaration. And I think this is something that needs to be reinforced. If we are going to utilize FEMA as a crisis agency, that role needs to be further strengthened and defined so that it's not that FEMA takes over. In fact, I was a little bit disconcerted when they put FEMA in charge of this response. I still felt that CDC and Health and Human Services should have been the lead, and FEMA supporting them. But just like we supported USAID in the response to the Haiti earthquake, as we supported Customs and Border and Health and Human Services, Family Services during the unaccompanied children on the border, and as we supported CDC in the Ebola crisis, FEMA is not just about hurricanes, wildfires, or earthquakes. We're all hazard, or they are an all hazard agency. And I think that strengthening that as the nation's crisis manager would further streamline federal response in future crises. It isn't that FEMA takes over, but FEMA helps many agencies who do not do crisis response full time, as you point out, do not have the relationships with the state emergency management teams like Director Gillarducci, and often find themselves struggling in those first days, first weeks to begin that response. The second part of this is the Stafford Act. Too often, I think FEMA is defined by what you can declare under the Stafford Act. And under the Stafford Act, for major presidential declarations, Congress has enumerated what would be considered a disaster. Pandemics are absent. So are cyber attacks. And in many cases, certain terrorist attacks, unless they involve an explosion or fire, could also conceivably be excluded. I think by amending the Stafford Act, adding pandemics, cyber attacks, and other events to that, so we are no longer uncertain about FEMA's role, could have turned on much of the individual assistance programs, the early ones, the early piece of this. When we're dealing with how to provide everything from disaster unemployment, food stamps, crisis counseling, legal assistance, all things that could have been turned on in that disaster. The third area that I think we need to address goes back to this whole supply chain. I like to say that efficiency is the enemy of resiliency. And what you're seeing in this pandemic in a just-in-time global delivery system has produced very efficient, low-cost supplies, particularly in the healthcare industry. But what we're seeing in this pandemic is only the tip of what could happen to other industries where we have critical infrastructures from communications, power systems, water supplies, treatment systems, across the whole vast definitions of what Homeland Security has defined as critical industries that are dependent upon international global supply chains. That has increased our vulnerabilities in competition, but also lack of ready access. I think we need to look at increasing the capabilities of domestic production. This will not be based upon a business model that says we get the best value. It is about creating the inefficiencies to build resiliency, either through tax credits or purchasing power. But if you wait until a crisis occurs and then discover that your supply chain that you need for critical infrastructure or supplies is located on the other part of the world, and now there's disruptions, either intentional or competition, or the fact that disasters can occur elsewhere and disrupt our supply chains, we are seeing with the pandemic how loss of domestic capability and production is actually impacting our ability to respond. So I don't know, again, as we look at this, just like our defense industry, we don't outsource building our submarines. Why are we outsourcing those supplies that are critical to key infrastructures that we need to have up and running? And I think, again, Congress can, in many cases, influence that through the ability of tax credits, the ability of purchasing power, in building these established relationships. And this gets to, I think, part of the matter about FEMA. I'll end right after this. When you tell FEMA to go find whatever you can find for PPE, get the results we got. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Fugate, for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Gillarducci to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Great. Well, good morning, Chairman Payne, Chairwoman Torres, small ranking members King and Crenshaw, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the federal government's personnel protective equipment procurement and distribution. I also discussed the state of California's response to the COVID-19 global pandemic, particularly the state's strategy for emergency procurement and distribution of life-saving PPE, which has been the largest disaster logistics and commodity distribution operation in the history of the state of California. On behalf of the state of California, I want to begin by extending my sincere gratitude to all of the federal agencies who have provided coordination, assistance, and funding in helping California respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Along with most of the nation and the world, California has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. As of July 13th, the state has 336,508 cases and has tragically lost 7,087 lives to the disease. However, California began dealing with indirect effects of this pandemic long before any other state. In January, when the state coordinated and accepted flights of repatriated citizens from China. Shortly after, California coordinated with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in an unprecedented operation to safely disembark and quarantine all passengers of the Grand Princess cruise ship. In January of 2020, as the COVID caused the entire city of Wuhan in the Hubei province in China to quarantine, California rose to meet the need when the State Department began repatriation flights to bring American citizens home. Cal OES activated the State Operations Center and worked with the State Department, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and the Health and Human Services Agency and other federal agencies and state agencies to assist in the coordination of these missions. On February 1st, there were 6 confirmed positive COVID-19 cases in California. By late February, the state enhanced its capabilities and dedicated to COVID response after the first case of community transmission in the state. By March 4th, the governor declared a state of emergency in anticipation of increasing rates of the COVID-19 infection. At that time, resource requests for PPE were accelerating, prompting the State Operations Center to begin distributing the 21 million N95 masks and 1 million surgical masks we had in our reserves. On March 6th, CalOES received notification from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that the Grand Princess cruise ship was heading to California from Hawaii. The Grand Princess, normally ported in San Francisco, initially went to Mexico before coming back to California to offload and pick up passengers. It then set sail to Hawaii. There were a unknown number of sick people on the ship. California supported the CDC, the Health and Human Services Agency, and ASPR with several high-profile missions to the Grand Princess while still at sea, including transporting medical staff and necessary PPE, testing of staff and passengers, delivery of essential medications to passengers, and several evacuations of sick individuals. This was a major operation that demanded California provide incident management support and large quantities of logistical support to Health and Human Services, the lead federal agency, including medical personnel and PPE. At this time, our partners at Fema, Region 9, were very responsive and provided as much assistance as possible, given they were not yet the lead federal agency. Following an extensive effort involving multiple levels of government, the state developed a plan for the ship to berth the Port of Oakland. First passengers disembarked on May 9th, and the last passengers disembarked on March 9th and March 16th, in a meticulous process to protect the health of everyone involved. Passengers, including Californians, other U.S. citizens, and foreign nationals, were transported to and quarantined at Travis Air Force Base, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, and other alternate care sites established by the state to ensure that no COVID-19 spread in the community before they returned home. During the repatriation of the Grand Princess operation, it quickly became clear that Health and Human Services had trouble with maintaining the tactical scope and scale to respond to the issues that arose during these missions. All deployed staff from Health and Human Services had specific purposes and were inflexible or unable to respond to evolving needs in the state in a timely way for challenges we were addressing. Recently, we have heard that the federal government has considered placing HHS back in the lead coordination role for this pandemic. This is concerning, as we believe it would not necessarily slow down and complicate the national response that is underway. FEMA's infrastructure and experience leading operations across the entire federal family and assisting states has actually been incredibly valuable and should be continued. Overall, the most significant challenging of the federal government's response to the pandemic has been the lack of a coordinated, centralized approach to secure, obtain, and distribute PPE. The federal government's response to the ongoing PPE crisis should be characterized as challenging or really unsuccessful. In a global pandemic with worldwide competition for critical life-saving assets, a national strategy to leverage federal buying power and consolidate assets, acquisition, and distribution was non-existent. In fact, every state was—
Mr. Gillarducci, I apologize, your time has expired. If you could just summarize the rest of your comment.
So the bottom line is that overall, the efforts of obtaining and coordinating on a national scale, since we're talking about PPE and the needs to get it in a timely fashion, setting up a competition where states were competing with each other and states were competing with the federal government for limited commodities that were absolutely necessary for life-saving is not a position that we should be in as a state or as a country. This is problematic. And supply chains and having a capacity to have domestic supplies, enhance those domestic supplies. And when you don't have those capabilities, implementing the Defense Production Act in a real way to be able to adequately and rapidly provide PPE is critical. In this case, that did not happen.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Curry to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Torres Small, Chairman Payne, Chairman Thompson, and Ranking Member Crenshaw, and other members that are here today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about GAO's work on the response to COVID-19 so far. Just 3 weeks ago, we issued our first report on the overall federal response to COVID-19. The report covers over $2 trillion in federal spending and programs, some of those programs which are brand new and on a scale that we have never seen before. Our folks have been working around the clock to provide oversight of this funding, and our goal, as always, is to provide accurate, fair, and balanced information to you, the Congress, and also the American people. This pandemic and the scale of the federal response is not even closely comparable to any disaster or public health emergency the country has faced. And we've been looking at this for over 2 decades, really since the anthrax attacks in early 2000. We've seen a marshaling of resources and a distribution of supplies that 8 months ago we would have thought was impossible. For example, for the first time in history, every state in the union, DC, most territories, and several tribes all have federal disaster declarations at the same time. That's never happened before. I think it's important that we recognize the federal, state, and local officials responding to COVID-19 around the clock and the millions of healthcare workers on the front lines. Let me just be clear that there have been major challenges. However, unlike other disasters where we can only look back at the response, we are still responding to the pandemic and will be for a while. As a result, we have a unique ability in this case to make course corrections now to address rising COVID-19 cases and looming challenges this fall when flu season hits and health experts expect COVID-19 to get even worse than it is now. I want to outline some of the challenges that we have seen in our work over the last few months, not to point fault or focus on the past, but to help figure out how we get better as we move forward. First, it's clear that existing preparedness and response structures and resources were overwhelmed. For example, we now know that the Strategic National Stockpile was not adequate to cover nationwide gaps in our public health system and underinvestments in that system for several decades. It's also more clear now that prior efforts to plan and prepare for a large pandemic were both, one, insufficient, and two, the gaps they did identify and who was supposed to address those gaps were not fixed in time for COVID-19. To its credit, Fema was brought in, as you've said and others have said, mid-response in early March to lead the massive logistical effort of supply acquisition and distribution, given these gaps. New command structures were established, comprised of federal agencies to manage this effort. Historical efforts to procure and distribute supplies, such as Project Airbridge and the use of the Defense Production Act to manufacture things like respirators or ventilator components, were undertaken. However, as we just reported a few weeks ago, it's clear that there has been confusion about, one, who is exactly making resource decisions at the federal level and how these are being prioritized for distribution to state and local governments. Again, this is not surprising given the scale of the response, but as new supply and testing shortages arise now, we have to get more clear about roles and responsibilities moving forward between the various levels of government. Second, coordination and communication have to get better. We've heard from states and others that it's not been clear why federal resources were provided when they were and how they were prioritized. This has to work both ways, too. As states and the private sector build their stockpiles and capabilities, the federal government needs to know what resources they have so they can understand where the gaps are and do advanced planning so those gaps can be filled when supply distributions ramp up again here soon as we get closer to the fall. Last, the federal government has tremendous contracting resources and capabilities. It's one of the key strengths it brings to help states and local governments in these types of disasters or emergencies. We've reported that the use of advanced contracts and coordination of these contracts helps states to avoid the need for non-competitive contracts after disasters. It also helps to avoid contract awards to companies that we later find out are unable to deliver on their promises. FEMA also needs to ensure that they have the adequate contract staff to handle this load, an issue that has been a challenge and will be a challenge as we get further into hurricane season. Real quickly, the last issue I want to point out is on after-action reporting. Years and years of work have shown us that after-action reports sometimes are not completed, and when they are, the gaps they identify are never followed up on. it's going to be critical that every federal agency in this response, which is almost all of them, follow up on these actions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Curry. I deeply appreciate it. I thank all of the witnesses for their testimony, and I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. Without objection, Ms. Jackson-Lee will be permitted to sit and question the witnesses as well. I now recognize myself for questions. We've heard, especially toward the start of this pandemic, the market for PPE and other medical equipment was difficult to navigate, to say the least, due to competition from other states and little guidance from the federal government. Mr. Fugate, as the lead federal agency, what do you think FEMA's role should have been in providing a national procurement strategy to avoid unnecessary competition and bidding wars between states?
Well, for FEMA, this is brand new. They don't procure this type of equipment on these scales, so the learning curve is very painful. And I think probably the biggest problem I saw early on is nobody was thinking a big number. If you're going to use the Defense Production Act, you have to use it early. The problem is there was not certainty it was going to get that bad. We can go back to H1N1 in 2009, where we prepared for a much worse pandemic, but U.S. was basically spared some of the impacts other countries did. So we didn't have a big number. We didn't turn on things early because the indicators, by the time it indicated the need, we were already behind the power curve. And then it was the mad scramble. Everybody was trying to get PPE with competition. I think we have to codify these rules ahead of time.
Thank you, Mr. Fugate. Mr. Curry, do you have anything to add in terms of FEMA's role in providing a national strategy?
Well, I agree with Mr. Fugate. I don't think anybody at the federal level expected the pandemic to be this bad. And as you said, this is why FEMA was called in late in the game, because they were the only ones left that actually had resources anywhere close to be able to handle something like this. You know, I have to go back to preparedness. We have found over and over again, for example, in 2019, Crimson Contagion, the exercise was conducted that was very similar to a pandemic situation like this. One of the key vulnerabilities that identified was that supply distribution and prioritization was going to be a mess. So we didn't take the steps and didn't devote the resources to address it then. And it's very difficult to address these things before something like this actually happens. But we do have the information to do it. And I think now, as I said in my opening, this response is still ongoing. So all is not lost. We're not just looking back. We can address these issues now for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. Mr. Gillarducci, California has an incredibly diverse population and several rural communities, which is similar to my state of New Mexico. Can you talk about whether there are any inequalities in the availability of supplies within the state and how you ensure that rural areas are adequately equipped to combat COVID-19?
That's a great question. So one of the major efforts that we put forth and lean deep into is to ensure that our rural communities in areas where maybe communities that had a lack of direct access to these kind of commodities were sourced and supplied efficiently and effectively. Particularly smaller hospitals. We would wrap around those smaller healthcare systems with not only PPE, but personnel to ensure that they had the capability they needed to sustain themselves. But look, it's a big state, and part of the effort was to initially decompress hospitals. So part of that was building in these federal and field medical stations and other kinds of field alternative care sites to be able to help those communities. And in rural California and in far North California, where we have very diverse populations, those were primary areas to ensure that we had enough resources.
Thank you, Mr. Gillarducci. To follow up on that, part of the diversity is Indian tribes. And right now, FEMA assistance for COVID-19 requires a 25% match from states and Indian tribes at a time when the virus is also drying up state and tribal revenues and leading to budget shortfalls. So in the limited remaining time, can you speak on the disproportionate impact the virus is having, and start with whether you believe waiving the cost share would enhance tribes' ability to respond to the pandemic?
Well, certainly tribes are unique in that they have the opportunity to, either acquire assistance from the federal government directly, or in some cases, come to the state for assistance. But let's be clear, waiving the cost share in this particular endeavor, this is such a massive, complicated event. It's long really a marathon. The fiscal impact across the board, as we've seen in the state and across other states in the country, is massive. And so if any event would be required to waive the cost share, really would be this one. And it would certainly could be very beneficial to tribes and local governments and state governments as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gillarducci, and I yield the remainder of my time. So I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Again, thank you everyone for being here. This question is for Mr. Fugate. And I just want to get a sense of, we can always nitpick in Monday morning quarterback in hindsight, but that's useful only to an extent. We have to understand what is truly possible to change in a realistic way. And so when it became that, along those lines, when it became clear that certain items were needed as part of the response, Operation Airbridge brought in and distributed PPE and other needed supplies. The Defense Production Act was invoked to ramp up ventilator production. On February 24th, the president asked Congress for money to fight COVID. It was unfortunately delayed at least a week after requested. Congress passed 3 COVID-related bills in March that were signed into law, and the federal government, through the Coronavirus Task Force, has continued to provide support. What additional action should the federal government have taken? I mean, when was there a fork in the road where we went left and we should have gone right? That would be a critical way to assess what we could have done better and maybe learn lessons for the future.
Well, my observations, and again, this is my opinion, we never looked at the worst case big number scenarios. My experience has been we always try to make the disaster fit our capabilities instead of looking at how bad something is going to be and what would be the potential shortfalls and how will we address it. And as you find with pandemics, if you're waiting for certainty, you're too late. So as we weren't looking at big enough numbers to see what the delta was between what we were doing and what the potential demand was. And quite honestly, I'd much rather testify to you that I got too much stuff than I ran out. And I think that's the thing we have to really enforce here is that we cannot right size these types of responses. We have to have too much or we're always going to run out.
Are you referring to, it seems like, as Mr. Curry had stated before, you're not referring to a decision made in the last few months. You're referring to decisions made over the last few years.
Absolutely.
Of preparation. Okay.
We looked at our stockpile as a push package. It was never designed to respond to a pandemic. It was only designed to be the first things out the door.
Okay.
But we had to also understand what the demand signal was. And with a novel virus, there was no telling. So essentially, you just start taking what I call beer and pizza man. How many people in the healthcare industry are we going to have to provide PPE for in every state simultaneously? That's a big number. What's our delta between what we can do now and what we can do to meet that number?
Do you have any insight as to why, after H1N1, our N95 mass depletion in the national stockpile was down 75%, if the numbers that I'm hearing are correct, and they were never replenished? Is there any good reason why that is?
Yeah, it was called sequestration.
But even though overall funding increased for the national stockpile,
there were a lot of decisions made that it took time to rebuild. But we identified that the stockpile was only going to be a push package, and in a pandemic would have to be augmented by production, purchasing, and ultimately the Defense Production Act.
Okay. Sticking with you, Mr. Fugate, does FEMA have the necessary authorities under the Stafford Act to respond to pandemics? Is there something you would change?
Yeah, I would add pandemics to the definition of a major presidential disaster declaration. Senator Collins actually tried to introduce this back in the 2008, I believe. There's also a congressional research report to Congress on whether or not FEMA can declare pandemics under the Stafford Act. Ultimately, it was always going to be the decision of the president, but because it's not listed, it tends to be a hindrance that it's not seen as FEMA's role to prepare for this.
One thing that's interested me in as we sort of have this national debate over responses, I hear from states sometimes that they felt like there was not enough of a national plan, and then I also hear that they weren't given the flexibility they needed to, say, do their testing planning the way they would have liked to. So as far as the state-federal response or relationship, are we still basically on the right track? What lessons can we learn, and what should be shifted in that relationship?
Having worked on both sides of this, I will tell you, I see the federal government as the rules and the tools and the funding, and then states, territories, and tribes implement it to their specific constituencies. What works in Florida won't work in North Dakota, but we should be using the same standards and guidelines to implement those programs, giving flexibility to the governors and their teams for the implementation.
Would you say that's pretty? From my point of view, that seems to be how it's always supposed to have happened, and how it basically has been happening now, obviously with some arguments here and there.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that I've heard calls for a federal czar to take over and run all this, and I would defer to that, going, one person in D.C. is not going to be able to make this work. But we need to have consistent guidance on the federal side, consistent funding resources, so that states can implement this as it's best for their states.
Thank you.
Can I yield back?
Thank you, Ranking Member. The chair now recognizes the chair of the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'd like to thank the gentlelady from New Mexico. As we, Mr. Fugate, it's once again good to see you. Always a pleasure. We appreciate your service to the country. It's been second to none. As we already have seen enacted here for disaster, do you believe that FEMA should retain lead of the federal government's response to coronavirus? Mr. Fugate?
I found it fascinating when they put FEMA in that lead role, because if you think about FEMA, they're the ultimate support agency. Either we're supporting governors in their response, or we're supporting a lead federal agency that has jurisdiction. And in FEMA's history, this goes back to the Challenger disasters, where FEMA was in support of NASA. By putting FEMA in the lead role, I think we lost a lot of the expertise that CDC should have had, that FEMA could have supported. So I think FEMA's role as the nation's crisis manager should be enforced, but I think it should also be seen that we want to make sure that the lead agencies with the jurisdiction, the legal authority, and the expertise are taking that lead, and FEMA supporting it, and hopefully making them more successful.
Thank you. Mr. Gillarducci, same thing?
Yeah, I'll agree with Craig. I think that the topic here is that not necessarily FEMA being the lead agency, but being the lead coordination agency at the federal level. Obviously, much like we've done here in California, our Health and Human Services is the lead agency dealing with the pandemic, but my office is providing the overarching coordination. I bring all the other state agencies and departments together. I interface between the state and federal governments. I ensure that we are all rowing in the same direction, so that we are not wasting time and we're not stovepiped in our effort or in our commitment of resources. So that's really, I think, from the national perspective, FEMA brings a great role, and they understand emergencies on a national scale. They have relationships with all the state directors, and they go down to the local. All disasters are local, and we have to look at it from that perspective of how these events are impacting local governments and state governments. And so I think that FEMA's got that ability to look at the big picture and make sure that action plans and the direction of the federal government is in the best interest and support of state and local governments.
Thank you. Mr. Curry, what impact does constantly shifting responsibility for various response activities have on the federal government's ability to effectively manage a nationwide emergency?
Well, I think that roles and responsibilities being clear is critical in this case. And I think, just to go off what some of the prior responses to your questions, I think we were victims of past successes in other situations. You know, typically in situations like H1N1 and Ebola and Zika and everything we've had over the last 50 to 60 years, the HHS and CDC has been able to handle the response to those public health emergencies. And so because of that, the structures we have had in place to deal with public health emergencies and pandemics is focused on their role and their responsibilities, which is appropriate. They have the medical expertise necessary. But what's clear in this case is they did not have the logistical capability that was required in a large pandemic. So moving forward, I think the key is going to be to us to figure out what new structures and new processes and roles and responsibilities need to be in place to handle the rest of this pandemic, and hopefully we don't have one, but one in the future as well.
Thank you. Also, Mr. Perry, how do you think deficiencies hindered FEMA's ability to properly develop and execute procurement strategy for COVID-19, given GAO staff's work on these issues? What is the number one outstanding recommendation you think that FEMA needs to address?
Well, a couple come to mind in this case. The first is, I'll throw out the contracting issue, which has been a huge challenge. That Chairman Thompson pointed this out in his opening statement. After Hurricane Maria, we had challenges trying to fill needs for tarps and other things. So in a huge disaster, this is very typical where you've exhausted all your pre-existing advanced contracts, and you go out looking for anybody that can fill those things. And it's not surprising that you come across contractors that don't have the capability. So I think we have got to get better in FEMA working with the states on advanced contracting and existing contracts to handle these types of things, especially in a pandemic situation where cases are going up and down in certain places. More tests are needed in some places and less in others. It's a constantly evolving situation. And unless we have advanced contracts that can scale where the need is, it's going to be very difficult to address this issue.
Thank you, and I know my time is expired.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize other members for questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. As a reminder, I will recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. Members are reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
I thank Madam Chairwoman and the ranking member and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. It's wonderful to see you all, and I look forward to a return to regular order where we can meet in person. Madam Chairwoman, America's supply chains should be based out of long-term, dependable trade partners in the United States or with stable, reliable nation states based upon relationships similar to USMCA. The dependability of our supply chains, especially as it regards to things like PPE, in response to something like this we've never seen before. This challenge that we are together overcoming one way or another, it's going to make us stronger. And I believe our supply chain is a primary example of that. These supply chains should be multi-layered, in my opinion, and many of my colleagues agree, established by the federal government, by state and local governments, and by private business end users that have, generally speaking, established a just-in-time, very efficient, economically efficient, but in response to a pandemic where nationwide we need an untold, previously unimagined volumes of PPE, the just-in-time model just doesn't work. Now, I must say that there's been some rather ugly things stated about our executive, who has responded, in my opinion, by rebuilding the federal infrastructure. It's been incredibly re-envisioned and greatly enhanced over the last 6 months in a robust response to a new and aggressive virus born of China and knowingly released across the world as the Chinese Communist government concealed their actions. President Trump and Vice President Pence have done an incredible job to literally rebuild America's pandemic response infrastructure. It's something we've never seen before. And may I say that our president inherited the system that was set up by previous presidents, not to blame President Obama and Vice President Biden or President Bush, but previous administrations had established a system that President Trump inherited And we just didn't see this coming as a nation. So I think it's fair to be critical, and it's our job to provide oversight. But let us take a step back from the political abyss that we stare at and give a fair evaluation of what our executive has done and how they perform.
Mr. Higgins, I deeply apologize. Would never want to interrupt your time normally, but due to technical issues, we need to recess. Members will please remain on the platform. The committee will stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair, and your time will be restored.
Thank you, ma'am.
Apologies.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you. We're in recess. The committee will reconvene. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Let me say that I very much admire and greatly respect you. You have been the face of calm and reason during this technological challenge. It's very clear to me and to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I'm quite sure why the people of your district have placed their faith in you. That being said, I'm going to be submitting my opening statement and question in writing. I'm being pulled to another congressional obligation at this time, and I'll be yielding the balance of my time to the ranking member. But before I do so, let me say that despite the best efforts of our colleagues, I say again that I call upon the majority to consider allowing the House to return to regular order and voting in person. Let's step away from proxy voting and remote committee appearance because, again, despite the best efforts, the technology just is not quite there yet. And I would say that we need to be in person regardless. But during a time of emergency, it could be foreseen that this is required, and we've learned a great deal. However, I'll be continuously calling for the return to regular order. It's within the constitutional parameters that I believe we should serve. But you have been fantastic during this hearing and this challenge. I apologize to our witnesses, and I'll be yielding the balance of my time to the ranking member. I yield now.
Thank you, Representative Higgins. I couldn't agree more, and I think the way you presented your case is exactly right. This is not a hit on this subcommittee at all. This is a hit on the entire Congress. It has to stop. We all know full well, we're all common sense people. We all know that we could do this in person and show the American people that we have just a modicum of courage, just a little bit. It'd be easy. We don't have to all congregate in there at the same time. Usually we don't anyway. Most of us watch from our office and then go in when it's our turn to ask questions. We could easily socially distance. We could wear masks. We could take all the proper precautions. We could easily do this. And yet our House of Representatives has chosen not to. This isn't the first time we've had technical problems. Of course we're going to have technical problems. Many other committees have had it. We've had it in this committee as well. This is not the chairwoman's fault. This is leadership from the top. And this is more than just about technical problems. It's about the ability to demonstrate to the American people that we have just a little bit of courage, just enough to actually show them that we are willing to take the slightest amount of risk just to do our jobs so that we can actually hear our witnesses instead of the garbled robotic mess that it sounded like at times when I was trying to listen to them. We could actually do our jobs. But we've sort of reversed what it means to have a sense of duty in this country, whereas it used to mean that we looked up to our heroes who overcame adversity and looked back on their hardship and said, look what I did, look what I overcame. Now we seem to elevate victimhood as a virtue. We say, look at the problems we face and look at us, we must hide. And that's virtuous, that's heroic. It's not heroic. We look like fools. We need to stop. We need to do better. We can easily do this. We all know how. We all know we could. And I think that we should be asking our leadership to put us back into Congress in person, stop the vote by proxy. We know we can do this safely. We've learned enough about this virus. We can do this by now. We can demonstrate to the American people that we are in this together and that we're willing to do our duty and do our job. It really is as simple as that. This is a highly unnecessary technical mess that we've involved ourselves in. And I hope we stop. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a public health nurse, I've been disappointed and quite frankly horrified by this administration's failure to equip our healthcare professionals and others on the front lines of this pandemic with the supplies that they need to stay safe while doing their jobs. 13 of my colleagues from the Illinois delegation joined my letter to the president back in March, urging the administration to lead a coordinated national plan to procure and deliver PPE where it was needed most. Even in March, we were already getting tearful phone calls from Illinois nurses who had worn the same single-use masks for 5 days straight. This is unacceptable. Yet somehow, 4 months later, we find ourselves still unable to obtain and distribute essential supplies to meet our basic needs. This is a colossal failure of leadership with truly life and death consequences. I'm glad our witnesses are here today to help us figure out what went so wildly wrong and to discuss improvements that need to be made. Mr. Fugate, as you know, one of the most important supplies for healthcare workers is the N95 mask, which protects the wearer from inhaling the virus. In March, the White House promised to deliver 300,000 N95 masks to my state of Illinois. When the shipment arrived, the boxes were found to instead contain surgical masks, which are looser and do not provide anywhere near the same level of protection for the wearer as the N95 mask. Based on your experience overseeing emergency management at the federal level, what concerns does this type of mix-up raise for you about this administration's coordination of the national response to this pandemic?
Well, I don't think it's so much a mix-up. I think it's what they had available. And it goes back to my original concerns that in facing a novel virus, we never looked at how big the numbers needed to be. And I think that's why we were not making decisions early on, such as increasing domestic production of N95 masks, reprioritizing that system. We just never took the steps to go, how big is this? We always, I think, adjusted based on what's available and tried to increase that, but we never got to what was going to be the big number. And so we're still seeing those impacts today.
Okay, thank you. Illinois is currently in phase 4 of its data-driven reopening strategy. And as more and more local businesses resume or increase their operations, and as we prepare to safely reopen schools this fall, we need PPE, and it's only going to continue to increase. Mr. Fugate, how should the administration be preparing to meet the increasing need for PPE across the country?
Well, again, I think it goes back to what is the number we're planning against? How much domestic production can ramp up? What can our international supply chain supply? And then what is the difference of that, or delta? And then what would we do to close that gap? Again, we know that the N95s are most critical for healthcare workers, but for others, the surgical mask or lesser grade protection is actually meeting the CDC guidance. So it comes back to what is the big number we've got to plan against? What's our capability domestically? What's our international supply capabilities? What's the difference? And then what steps can we take to close those gaps?
In addition to the administration's own failure to provide the correct materials, another challenge our frontline workers and state leaders have had is to contend with is fraud. An investigative journalist at ProPublica broke a story last month about an operation that repackaged non-medical grade masks to remove the medical use prohibited warning. And then they sold those repackaged masks to a Texas emergency manager for use in hospitals. When the reporter contacted Homeland Security Investigations to ask about this case, HSI replied only that they were trying to, quote, determine if any violations exist or if mishandling occurred, end quote. Mr. Fugate and Mr. Gillarducci, can you each explain on why the proliferation of fake equipment is so dangerous and what role does a successful federal response play in preventing this?
Well, this goes back to when you have shortfalls in critical supplies, people will attempt to use that to provide products that may not meet the standards. And as we saw with that investigation in a gray market area, it's not always clear what the violations were. If we had better handle on domestic production that was more regulated, I think we could address some of these concerns. But at the time that the FEMA and others were going out procuring, there was not time to go out and do diligence. Almost all that was done electronically. And so it wasn't until you actually had products showing up that in many cases we found out that it wasn't what the teams thought they were ordering.
Well, at the end of the day, scammers will take advantage of unmet consumer needs, and right now we see scammers providing everything from fake tests to useless PPE. Especially in the middle of a global pandemic, the responsibility should not be on consumers to authenticate their PPE or tests. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Chairman Torres Small, very much. I think I want to follow up, Mr. Fugit, on the questions Ms. Underwood just asked. There seems to be, and I had occasion to ask a question of Governor Pritzker about this, there seems to be a sort of a chorus of condemnation of the administration for not having an overall coordinated response. And it seems to be mostly connected to the question of how much PPE is available. But you can't just wish PPE into existence and put it in the right spot. Isn't that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
And you just explained in response to Ms. Underwood's question that having a quantity of PPE to meet a sudden huge need is a logistics problem. That you've got to get production capacity in place. If it's not sufficient, you got to add to it. You got to figure out from a disparate number of economic actors across our economy and maybe the economy around the globe how to get items produced that don't currently exist and then get them delivered to the right place, correct?
Yes, sir.
And is it necessarily so that a federal and any federal administration, yours or the current one, faced with an unprecedentedly large demand that's sudden, is necessarily going to get that problem solved faster by taking control of the entire market through the Defense Production Act or the like?
When we war gamed what a pandemic looked like, that turned out to be our only option. It's a drastic tool. It has lots of disruptions. However, what we found was because we have built a just-in-time healthcare system, it was going to take a draconian tool like the Defense Production Act to even begin to meet the needs, and that it was not going to be a rapid response tool. So it would have to be turned on relatively early when their numbers often wouldn't justify that action. But by the time the numbers did, we were too far behind. And as we had explored this became one of the themes. Failure to turn on the Defense Production Act early, your strategy now became one of hope you can meet demand. Turn it on early, you could meet demand, but if there wasn't a need for it, it caused big disruptions. So it is not a precise tool. It goes back to the whole issue of there is no slack in the system for healthcare. And that exasperates what we're seeing now, that there wasn't even reserves to start with in most of the healthcare industry because everybody is just time delivery, no stockpiles, they don't prepare for this. And the federal government became the default for this.
Yeah, I appreciate your candor in having described that now a couple of times, that the issue is one of many years in the making. I think it's unfortunately very counterproductive to go try to assess blame on that. The decisions are what they are. It's a resource allocation issue. It's existed for many, many years. But look, let's take, for example, because it seems to persist, the notion, as you say, using the DPA would be your only tool, but it wouldn't necessarily in the short term mean that you could be sure from that decision point at the beginning of the crisis that you were going to produce more in the short term by using that than in allowing market mechanisms to function. Isn't that so?
No, sir. Market mechanisms are why we're in the situation we are. We're just in time delivery system. It's the most cost-effective way to run it. It doesn't return to shareholders. An inefficient system would have had a lot more capacity to ramp up. And DPA actually does not start out with taking over manufacturing. The first thing, which was early on, DPA gives the federal government to go out and procure very large quantities and also prioritize those products being domestically produced or coming into the country where they're needed most. And that can happen immediately with DPA. We used it during Superstorm Sandy to get interpreters. So it is a tool that gives you immediate response if there is product there, and then ultimately gives you the ability to redirect industry to meet a strategic need that otherwise would not have been met if you only went to a driven capitalist system. hasn't built that capacity. There's no reason why you would have excess capacity unless you had some incentive, either through tax credits or guaranteed markets that required you to purchase that. It's not fair to industry to say you should solve this problem if we're not going to build in the tools to ensure production exists.
So you're talking about a long-term incentive solution, though, that would build more capacity to be in place over the long term, correct?
Yes, sir. And pandemics are just one example of our global supply chain and vulnerabilities we have in critical infrastructure when we depend upon global supply chains where the suppliers may not always share our views or interests.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bishop. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barragan.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. As I've heard the testimony, I'm a little surprised to be hearing so much of how wonderful the response was or how couldn't it be done better. I've heard quite and have read a lot differently. I read a lot more about the administration's failures early on. Late January, we had Dr. Bright warning about the lack of PPEs, having to ramp it up quickly. Those calls went ignored. We had the president basically saying this thing was going to go away, it was going to disappear, making the mask very politicized. So there's been a lot of failures with this administration, which is why I think it's so critical that we have these hearings and we make sure we don't repeat what has happened here and that we be honest with the American people, because honesty will save lives, even if we don't like what the outcome is going to be or what people or what people's fears are. We have to address those. I want to direct my first question to you, Mr. Fugate. As part of the response to homelessness during COVID-19, FEMA has committed to reimburse 50 to 75% of expenses for shelter and temporary housing through their public assistance program, Category B. However, some local governments and agencies, like the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, have expressed challenges with the FEMA program, such as not knowing whether the program will be extended for the coming months. Along the same lines, they have been told that it could take 4 to 5 years for localities to receive FEMA reimbursements. Mr. Fugate, in your experience as the former administrator, is there anything FEMA could be doing to better notify localities if programs will expire or be extended?
Yes, this goes back to, and I'm sure Director Gillarducci can amplify this, is if FEMA is given the authority to extend this again, these declarations are at the direction of the president. So the White House would have to concur. They could give guidance to states what the programs are, what the likelihood of being extended are. And as far as reimbursement goes, yes, it can be a long time. It can also be done in 2 weeks, which we did in Hurricane Isaac in the city of New Orleans for their overtime. So FEMA doesn't have to take forever to move the money, but there has to be an understanding the faster FEMA moves money, the greater risk there will be of errors, the potential that there may be a requirement to seek reimbursements back. And I think the other thing is the cost share is something that should be factored in, that it is 75% federal. It's never going less than 75%. But the cost share going up to 100% may also be required in those jurisdictions that are seeing both the impacts of COVID-19 demand as well as reduction in income.
Thank you, sir. Along the same lines, last week, the mayor of Toluca, Mississippi, testified that they're still waiting on reimbursements from FEMA after a 2014 tornado caused major damage to the city. That was 6 years ago. Can we expect localities to wait this long for FEMA reimbursements? And how can we speed up the process to ensure that local governments quickly receive the reimbursements?
We were doing reimbursements and still doing reimbursements for Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. In fact, in my last year at FEMA, we were approving $1 billion grant on wastewater treatment systems or wastewater systems. So the rebuilding process is a reimbursed as you build back. That can take a while. I'm more concerned about the immediate cost, which is the Protective B response cost, that FEMA should be moving that money out very quickly. Congress has provided the funding, but this may be something our friends at the General Accounting Office can weigh on, is sometimes we get so fearful of making mistakes, we slow the process down with bureaucracy instead of focusing on getting money out quickly and cleaning up later with controls in place. Sometimes there's just such a fear of making mistakes, we end up building so much process, we never seem to get the money out quickly.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gillarducci, California was one of the first states faced with managing the coronavirus, especially as it received repatriation flights and returning cruise ships when the outbreak began. Can you tell us more about the evolution of your coordination with the federal government on response efforts? And did you notice a difference once FEMA took over as a lead?
Thanks for the question. California was engaged early on when the first repatriation flights were brought back in. We worked with the Department of State initially, and then Health and Human Services Agency. First to set up a repatriation center in one of our airports in Southern California, Ontario. Came pretty quickly that was going to be sufficient. We needed brick and mortar facilities to keep people separated. That was our first indication that the virus and the conditions that were happening in China and the repatriation members that were coming back could be potentially sick. And so we worked to get brick and mortar barracks at March Air Force Base initially for the repatriation. That, of course, then extended into Travis Air Force Base in Northern California and then Miramar Naval Air Station.
Mr. Gillarducci, I appreciate it. I apologize. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me thank our ranking member, Mr. Crenshaw, and Congressman Donald Payne Jr. of New Jersey for the leadership that they're showing. Let me thank our expert witnesses as well. Being a New Yorker, I think that I have a very unique lens into the response of the administration. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I signed a letter calling on the White House to invoke the Defense Production Act to meet the shortfall of PPE and other other critical supplies facing my district. The people of New York City were hit first by this pandemic. And as we cried out for PPE and ventilators, our pleas were met with a collective shrug from the administration. By the time the Defense Production Act, the limited way in which it was utilized, was finally invoked, frankly, it was too late. As the case numbers begin to rise again across this nation, we are once again finding this administration, I believe, asleep at the wheel. We have had months to prepare, but comprehensive contact tracing is still far from a reality. And even basic supplies are once again in short supply. For example, FEMA repeatedly touted Project Airbridge as a success story in accelerating the importation of critical PPE. FEMA has indicated that at least 50% of those supplies were directed to hotspot areas. But there's been a serious lack of transparency to confirm this actually occurred. Despite repeated requests, we have yet to receive information on where the supplies went and other basic details like how long it took to coordinate each flight. I will tell you that, it's important to have this transparency because we're getting word on the ground, particularly in the height of the pandemic, that was actually redirecting critically needed supplies that were intended for one portion of the nation to other portions of the nation. I don't know whether that is true or not, but having transparency about what took place would answer those questions. So my first question is for Director Gillarducci. How effective was the Airbridge in helping to meet your state's supply needs? Were you given any insight into where these supplies went or whether a county in your state was deemed to be a hotspot for the sake of the program to better coordinate the state's efforts to surge PPE into communities?
Thanks for the question. Well, Operation Airbridge eventually became a helpful tool. Initially, it was not coordinated with the states. It was not communicated effectively. We did not know where PPE would be distributed to. And quite frankly, the Airbridge effort actually enhanced the competition by which the states were having to deal with. In essence, Operation Airbridge cornered the market in any available PPE that we could possibly get. So I think in the end, if it was a more coordinated and communicated effort, and that PPE was brought in as a central capability that we could all benefited by, it would have worked much better. But unfortunately, it did not work that way.
All right, Administrator Fugate, I want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues. We appreciate your years of service, your dedication, and your focus. In many respects, as all of my colleagues have indicated, you were sort of blindsided by the scope and breadth of depth of what we've had to deal with as a nation with respect to the coronavirus and its spread. But how does Project Airbridge compare to your experience establishing public-private partnerships while at FEMA throughout your tenure?
Well, if you remember during Superstorm Sandy, one of our challenges was getting utility trucks into the area quickly. President Obama held a conference call with utility companies. He said, we've got equipment on the West Coast, but it's going to take us a week or more to get it to the East Coast. Can you help us? So FEMA coordinated with Defense Transportation Command. We used C-17s, and from the time of that call to the first touchdown of those trucks, it occurred within 24 hours. So we've worked with the private sector. In fact, we look at the private sector as part of the team. And we have used federal assets, including DoD assets, to move equipment from the private sector to achieve an outcome, which was to get utilities turned on faster in Superstorm Sandy.
Very well. I'll yield back, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for this very timely hearing. Important findings will make a difference in life and death across this nation. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Well, you've been trying to educate people for a couple of months. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for your kindness and generosity in yielding to me. I am here in one of the major hotspots of COVID-19, and we are not really seeing an end, and which I think is the uniqueness of COVID-19, is that both science and medicine have now understood that it is not a virus that they control, the virus controls us, but we know that the basic elements of it is the initiatives that we had of cleanliness, sanitizing, gloves, eyewear has come into play, as I'm wearing right now, masks and mandatory mask orders. But we also know that in the system of logistics and equipment, we suffered greatly in being prepared. We suffered greatly with no PPEs. We were fighting, and I really mean it, fighting for masks. We were seemingly on markets that were impossible to penetrate in terms of trying to get PPEs. And of course, the big one was test kits, test kits, test kits. I would hear from my colleagues across the nation, where are the test kits? I can't get in. Administrator Fugate, we have worked together in the past over the years with hurricanes. And I think if I know you well, your key definition is preparedness. I'd like to hear again, in light of Texas, over 235,000 cases, now moving up to 6,000 deaths here in Houston, 60,000 plus, and number of deaths that we have as our numbers continue to grow. I happen to hospital right now where we're getting the military team, not in the hospital, but walking through a hospital where a military team will be coming to add to our medical needs here in terms of staffing. Administrator Fugate, can you speak to the absolute crucialness of strategic plans particularly on unknown disasters like a COVID-19, and the importance of early on developing a plan for equipment, which would include, please, testing, which I understand that people in Florida right now are fighting to get tests.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. It may sound trite, but what I've learned in disasters is by the time you know how bad something is, it's a little late to change the outcome. And I learned this a long time ago, and it's a simple process. It may sound trite, but it works for me. First thing is, define the disaster. Think big. Don't try to wait till you have all the information. Just go, how bad could it be? The thing is, go big. You got to start ordering resources and personnel for that event and looking at shortfalls and capacity. You need to go fast. The more precision, the better you're waiting for informed information, the slower you get. And the last part is be smart about it. As the numbers start coming in, adjust, and hopefully you're adjusting downward. But you never get time back in a disaster. And again, I was, as far as this being unforeseen, unprecedented, I actually helped set up an exercise back in January in the state of Florida, a no-notice exercise on COVID-19. I think we've had a lot of missed opportunities, but I think this has gotten to the point where nobody wants to talk about what didn't work. I think we also need to consider something like a National Transportation Safety Board style committee that's standing, that's nonpartisan, to review these types of events, to learn lessons so they don't become lessons observed, but are actually then implemented in the changes to change future outcomes.
Well, Administrator, if I could very quickly, my research and testimony that I secured in the Homeland Security Committee hearing was that the administration actually were aware of COVID-19 as early as October 2019, which means we should have long since had some kind of discernible plan. But there are two issues that I'd like your comment on. I know already that you're not an educator, but a great public servant. The issue of test kits. That became almost of crisis proportion, with people really literally in the streets trying to beg for test kits, trying to get states to get test kits. It was unbelievable. We're now with lines of people in different cities trying to get test kits. It emphasized when you have something that is so strategically important to fighting back the disaster, which is COVID-19, how important it is to get ahead of that. And then any comment on what elements we should look at as school districts across the nation want to do the best thing for their students in light of the circumstances that you see. You're not a physician, I know that, but in terms of being prepared. Thank you. And thank you for your service.
The test kits are really critical if we can get containment. When we're seeing the infection rates we have now, I don't think testing is going to change the outcome. If we get containment and then we can test people and isolate people that are exposed, we'll get this under control. But these again go back to big numbers. How big and how much would you need in a worst case scenario? Not what the plan says, not what you think you're going to need, but just go, how bad could it be, and start working backwards.
Thank you, Mr. Huguet.
Courtesies.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I so appreciate everyone's patience in the midst of all of this. I know we've got a hard out at 12:30, so I just want to close by thanking the witnesses for their valuable time, patience, and testimony. I want to thank all the members for their questions, patience, and dedication to serving their districts. I deeply respect my colleagues, and I do not judge any differences we may have in opinion for a lack of courage in the way they serve during this crisis that we face together. The members of the subcommittees may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the hearing stands adjourned. Mr. Curry, I really appreciate your time as well. I know this was not what any of us would have wanted.